Well, as we mentioned earlier, UNICEF has released a report saying that war and persecution has displaced close to 50 million children across the world. 28 million were displaced last year alone. The aid agency is urging authorities to end the detention of refugee children and stop separating families. We're joined live now by William Spindler, the Senior Communications Officer for the UNHCR. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Spindler. Now, these figures are dire, to say the least, but unfortunately they aren't particularly surprising. Can you outline the main countries where these children are coming from? I assume that the likes of Syria is probably near the top of the list.
Yes, that's correct. War and conflict have a disproportionate impact on children, although only a third of the world's population is made up of children under 18. Half of all refugees are children, and the main countries of origin of these children are Syria, Afghanistan, and other countries that provide the most of the refugees in the world. In the case of refugees from Syria and Afghanistan, children make up a very large proportion, children who are traveling with their parents, but also increasingly children on their own. And this is a very worrying development.
And Mr. Spindler, as we speak to you, we're showing vision of many of these children who are displaced, and we have seen images which have attracted the likes of social media. For example, Omrad Daknish in Aleppo last month. So it seems though that people see these pictures, they're disheartened, and then they move on with their day. What needs to happen for there to be real action on the ground for these children?
Well, a number of things need to happen. First of all, the countries that are hosting these children need to ensure that they have access to education, because one of the problems that we see is that when children arrive as part of a refugee emergency, the main priority in those situations is to provide people with the basics, things like food, water, shelter, and education is left to this behind. And what we know from experience is that the refugee situation tends to last much longer than people expect, and therefore we need to look into long-term impact of being refugees. So that's for the countries that are hosting children refugees. For those countries that are receiving them, for instance, countries in Europe, European countries have legislation to protect children, but in many cases that legislation is not applied to refugee children. It's applied to national children, but once children arrive as part of a refugee situation, they're seen first of all as refugees or asylum seekers or migrants, and not as children. Children are children regardless of where they are, and they have the same need for protection. So we need to ensure that countries apply those provisions that apply for their own children to refugee children.
And Mr. Spindler, I think among many points of merit you raised there was both the need for education and the long-term effects of the current 50 million children displaced. Now, obviously, in the immediate future, these children are suffering terrible pain, persecution, and potentially death. In the long term, if they don't receive education now, worst case scenario, what's going to happen? I mean, are the likes of different terror organisations possibly going to manipulate this situation to radicalise these poor innocent children?
Well, the long-term consequences of children not having an education are devastating for any society. The prospects for countries rebuilding after a period of conflict, of course, will be much bleaker if the new generation has not been educated. And that's why it's so important that all refugee children have access to school. And what we see is that the impact of refugee situations has an impact not only on refugee children, but also on the children of the countries that are receiving them. Because let's not forget, the poorest countries are the ones that are receiving most refugees, and the poorest communities in those countries are usually the ones that host refugees. So refugee children are competing with local children for scarce resources. We need to make sure that every child, whether it's a refugee or a national has access to education. And that means investing on infrastructure, on schools, on teachers, and so on. And that's why it's so important to look at the long-term consequences of this situation and not simply on the emergency period where normally funding is available. But once we look into the longer term, then we find it more difficult to raise the money necessary for children to actually have a future.
William Spindler from UNICEF, you do very important work, and we certainly hope the world heeds your warnings. Thank you for joining us.